Welcome back to Majority Rules. I'm Lauren Leader. It has been quite a couple days since our last episode, which we filmed just a couple hours before the Trump verdict, the 34 counts of guilty, 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 guilty. I spent the weekend with my colleague Mark Halperin here at 2A, doing focus groups with undecided voters, what we're calling the double haters, which are really voters that aren't so thrilled about either candidate. But we got fascinating insights from them. I spoke about it on Morning Joe yesterday. It's also up on the 2A site, but just so interesting. The input from voters who, interestingly, trusted the justice system, thought that the trial was fair, that the judge was fair, that the jurors were fair, even if they thought that the trial itself was politically motivated, the timing of it was politically motivated. But it was really, really interesting just to hear the sort of nuance and the subtle, the deep thinking of Americans who are trying to make sense of this new news of the first time in American history that a former president and now candidate for president of the United States is a convicted felon. They mostly thought it didn't matter. And I think that's been a huge part of the news narrative over the weekend. I have been arguing, as I always do, that it's going to be different with a lot of the women, that women voters who, many of whom have turned away from Trump already, many of whom were supporting Nikki Haley, but also supporting Biden, this will make a difference. But also they're motivated by a bunch of other things that still matter a lot, including, of course, abortion access. But in the context of this, we keep saying unprecedented. It's so annoying that we keep saying unprecedented, but what's the other word for it? We've really never been here before. But other countries have been here before. And I'm really excited for today's guest, my good friend and colleague, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a historian and a writer and who wrote probably the most important book ever written about sort of the rise of authoritarianism, what that looks like around the world, and has been a tireless sort of advocate for helping Americans, and especially those of us in the news media, think about how to understand the authoritarian tendencies of Trump and, frankly, other folks who are who support him and what that means. So I'm not going to do a ton of talking today. I really wanted to talk to Ruth. There's so much to get through. And Ruth, I forgot to say the name of your amazing book, of course, which is Strong Men, which looks at not just the rise of authoritarianism, but what's always fascinated me is, and we've talked about before, is the links between misogyny and sexism and the rise of authoritarianism and how much those things tend to go together. Very interesting context, given that Trump's conviction was all surrounding his relationship with his extramarital affair with a woman. So much to unpack. So Ruth, welcome to Majority Rules. Thanks for being here. Ruth, I seriously don't know where to start. I mean, the New York Times today so over the weekend, aside from obviously the verdict on Friday and Thursday night, which we're all still trying to get through, over the weekend, Trump did an interview with Fox News where he talked very much about his plans for retribution. That was also, it's a lead story in the New York Times today, with a picture of Steve Bannon and a conversation about how Bannon and other senior aides to Trump have a pretty specific plan for how they plan to exact vengeance on their political enemies. But you've been following this trajectory of Trump and his sort of playing footsie with dictatorship for a long time. So why don't we start with how are you thinking about these last few days? Because it's pretty head spinning, I think, for a lot of Americans.
Well, it was very moving to me that the trial happened in the way that it did, that we had a fair and free trial, because this is quite apart from the verdict, the trial itself would never have happened in any of the countries whose leaders Trump is constantly praising. That wouldn't have happened in Russia and China and Turkey. And these are places where you can't even criticize the leader. You get a lawsuit or you get put in prison or worse, much less hold somebody accountable. And so, to have jurors who did their civic duty and accepted this, to have the judge, the whole courtroom, and things that we totally take for granted, but wouldn't be possible, and in the places that Trump sees as a model for our country.
I was really
So I
struck
found
this
it very
weekend.
moving.
I was moved, as I said in my intro, by the folks that we spoke to in this focus group this weekend, who were all from Georgia and North Carolina. And what was really fascinating, Ruth, was that, first of all, none of them could really explain what Trump had been convicted of. And I think that's also just speaks to, like, first of all, it was not a televised trial. Most people were doing their jobs day in and day out, and people weren't really following it. You know, it wasn't the most maybe obvious thing to prove. But despite the fact that they couldn't really articulate it, and they did think that the timing was politically motivated. They felt that Bragg had probably bought the charges in an election year specifically to hurt Trump, and yet they still believed that the trial was fair and that Trump's claims that he had it was a rigged jury and a rigged judge, they didn't buy that. And it gave me hope in a sense, because I think in this time where we have such lack of trust in the institutions, I thought it was really interesting that people just didn't think it was credible to say that a jury would be rigged.
Yeah, because I think, people see that it's an insult to these just regular people who came into their duty knowing that they would become targets of violent threats during and after, which indeed has happened. And I also think that it's a double-edged thing, because we're in the middle of a very concerted, massive effort to delegitimize all our institutions, the judiciary, the way the courts operate, elections. And so everything is rigged. And we've been seeing how on important TV shows everywhere, sitting GOP lawmakers pretty much say they're only going to accept the results if it's free and fair, meaning if their cult leader wins. And I think so on the one hand, that's been repeated for years. And so a lot of people believe they've lost faith in our electoral system. But other people are probably fatigued. They're sick of Trump saying that everything is rigged, that being a sore loser. And this trial, because it involved an extramarital affair, even if, the connections between that and electoral interference weren't grasped by everybody, I think that, some of them are tired of his misogyny and tired of his just total lack of morals and his anger, and it's just not becoming of a leader.
What was great is that a bunch of them said that they said, compared to other things he's probably done, this wasn't that big of a deal. And that was really interesting, was like this sense that like people have a sense of him as a pretty corrupt guy generally, and that this maybe wasn't even the worst of it. But let's take a step back for a second, because you are someone who has spent a professional lifetime studying authoritarians and the rise of authoritarianism. What are the hallmarks of a sort of a leader who has a tendency towards overturning institutions or wanting to be an authoritarian? What do they have in common around the world, those authoritarian leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all the people in my book, for example, are what's called personalist leaders, because they are amoral people who only care about themselves. And what they do is they make their parties and their governments personal tools. And we've seen that with the GOP, how, they have to pledge personal loyalty to Trump, and how the RNC is paying Trump's personal legal bills, how he's put his family there. And, during Trump 1.0, it was Ivanka and Jared. Now it's Lara Trump at the head of the RNC. So that politics comes to revolve around the leader's personal, financial, and legal and other needs. And so that's a very important part of it. And once you get into a situation like that, where the executive is going to overwhelm the judiciary and in a place like Russia, or, of course, Congress or Parliament just becomes a rubber stamp for the leader, then there's no checking the leader's desires at all. And that's what authoritarianism is. It's when there is no restraint on the leader, and the leader is also immune from prosecution and can commit any kind of crime and pay no penalty.
Well, very good timing to bring up the immunity question, because we may or may not have an answer from the Supreme Court on the immunity case tomorrow, or sometime. Certainly it will be in the next few weeks. So I want to talk about that, but can we just go back to Russia for 1 second and to some of the other countries? So, well, first of all, didn't you find it interesting that this weekend was when Trump chose to like suddenly take up the cause of Evan Gershkovich, the imprisoned Wall Street Journal reporter. He claimed this weekend that that Putin had already agreed to free him and would free him as soon as he became president, but isn't going to do it if Biden's president. But I thought that was so interesting that Trump is suddenly championing somebody who's been unfairly imprisoned in a regime that doesn't do fair trials, that just locks up their political enemies, at the same time that he himself has just been convicted. I don't know. I thought the irony, the contrast there was kind of amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is just Trump blustering because Trump is no friend of the press. Trump hates the press unless you're like Fox News or you're just, his sycophant. That's the only kind of press, and that's typical of authoritarians. He's trying to boast of how close he is to Putin, that Putin will do this as a personal favor to him, and that we'll be safer in the world if he's there because he's on good terms with Putin. And in fact, if you follow Russian propaganda TV, Kremlin TV, they regularly make fun of Trump as like a kind of useful fool, as a Putin puppet. They humiliate him on camera. And so it's very dubious that Trump would be able to obtain anything because Putin, he'll use and discard Trump, just like that's what authoritarians do. Trump uses and discards people, but so does Putin.
Are there other places in the world where someone who's been convicted of crimes what happened with Lula, right? Wasn't Lula in Brazil convicted? You had like Rahul Gandhi went to jail. We've had the former prime minister of Pakistan was jailed for corruption. So how does this compare? Like, are we the only place? We're not the only place in the world, right, where somebody who's been convicted. But I always felt like the implications in those other countries were that those imprisonments or those charges were in fact political retribution versus, although maybe it's different for Lula. I don't know. Like, you study politics around the world. Is there anything even remotely equivalent to Trump running, having been convicted in this way?
We were an outlier in that somebody who pulled off a coup, it failed, but who incited a violent, insurrection that sent people, his own, party running for their lives, and nothing was done about it, so that he was still running for president. That we were an outlier, because in other countries, even if you just narrow to people who tried similar things, they had to go into exile or they're in prison.
Right, like Bolsonaro's still in exile, right? Is Bolsonaro still in exile? Well, where's Bolsonaro? Because he sort of did a copycat January 6th, right?
Yeah, but Bolsonaro's case, Bolsonaro's case, he was convicted, but not of that. He was convicted of spreading election fraud propaganda, and he was banned from politics for 5 years. Sorry, he's banned for running for office until 2030. And that happened in Italy too. Berlusconi was finally convicted 2 years after he left office, and he was banned from running for office for 5 years. So other countries use bans very effectively, because if you have a big personality cult, the only thing that can start to deflate it, to shrink it, is people realizing that you cannot be their leader anymore. And so that's what other countries have done. And these are countries that had dictatorships in the past. So they know what the stakes are. We're the only people who were hanging around, letting him, be running again for office with no penalty. It was crazy.
Oh, so in the case of Berlusconi, was it the court that tried him, that banned him then from running again, or was it an act of parliament? I actually don't even know.
No, it was part of he was convicted of including of underage, sex with an underage girl, and bribery and other things. And then as part of his sentence, he did not go to jail because he was deemed too old. And he did community service, but he was banned from running for office for 5 years in Italy.
No one is, of course, talking about that now. I mean, that it doesn't seem like that's even in the realm of possibilities in terms of Trump, right? That is not something that the judge in New York would have any jurisdiction to do, which is really interesting, right? I mean, that's not even a question.
It's unfortunate because it is something that's very effective. But, there's a very long list of countries that have convicted, former heads of state, Israel, France, Peru, as I mentioned. And so we are just, this is part of our belief that, quote, it can't happen here. We're unable, this is a big, learning moment for us, because we've been unable to imagine that authoritarianism can take hold here despite all of the evidence to the contrary.
Okay, so let's talk that through for a second, though, because I mean, obviously I see the warning signs. I would be, I've been concerned since January 6th, all of those things. On the other hand, like, you would really have to try to convince me that our institutions are not stronger than in a lot of places in the world. And I think, like, the Supreme Court especially, there are a lot of problems with the Supreme Court right now, including a couple of justices who we know, are pretty compromised on this question of Trump and January 6th. And yet, like, they're mostly institutionalists, right? I think you could wind up with an 8-2 decision. I mean, you'd hope it's 9-0. You'd hope it's like a unanimous decision on the immunity question, right? Because, if a president is immune, we're not the United States. I mean, the foundations of our nation are that we don't have a king, right? That everybody is the same in the eyes of the law. But I don't know, like, I get, maybe I'm one of those people. I want to take seriously, I want to believe what Trump says about his interest in becoming a dictator on day one. That's his quote, right? I want to believe certainly what he's saying about trying to persecute his opposition if he gets elected again. But I do have a hard time believing that our institutions can't stand. You can prove me wrong. I know you spend a lot of time proving people wrong on this.
Well, I see, just keeping to the Supreme Court, I see the Supreme Court in a different light. It's extremely compromised. And two of the justices are really far-right activists. This is Alito and Thomas, who have no business being on the court. They're completely compromised. And they have been very active in this this effort I talked about before of delegitimizing our institutions. And you do that not only by the rulings you vote on and you make, but you do it by your personal conduct. So when Thomas says, I'm not recusing myself it's because these people are not in democracy anymore. They're authoritarians. He truly doesn't believe that he should be held accountable and that conflicts of interest should apply to him. The same with Alito. The reason they flew those flags repeatedly, including, this just like so insulting to the United States, is because they wanted to signal that they are no longer espouse democratic notions of justice. They're out. Now, the other ones, Kavanaugh, I have no illusions. He's there because of Trump. He's loyal to Trump. So although there are obviously some amazing people on that court, I don't see the court, which has no ethical watchdog or oversight. That's a huge problem. So I'm a lot more pessimistic, because there are people there who are really gunning for our democracy. They are bad actors and should be nowhere near any court. They should be disbarred, honestly.
Okay, well, it's clearly not happening, unfortunately. I mean, it's just not.
No,
like, it's not.
But that's my opinion.
Biden, Biden, who's arguably faced like the biggest crises of the court, then completely backed down and was unwilling to do anything, like to think about changing the dynamics of the court, right? He did this. Don't you remember? We forget, but when he became president, after 2020, they were supposed to like look at the Supreme Court and think about, should we have 11 instead of 9? And Biden's not that guy. Like, he's not reforming the court. He doesn't have that kind of willingness to take big, bold, dramatic action on a structured institution. I don't even think he's going to fight the filibuster on some things that Democrats are saying they'll do. They'll override the filibuster in the next session if they have the majority. I don't even think that's going to happen. I mean, I'm very skeptical that Biden ever allows the filibuster to be overturned. All right, so what's your prediction? Are you saying you think that this court is going to give the president absolute immunity in their decision?
I don't know what the exact vote will be, but those I all those who are tied are there because of Leonard Leo. Just do the research and look at who's there and why they're there. They have come so far. These are people who think they're almost there, and there's so many
Almost
people
where?
who have been. They're almost there to get some form of anti-democratic government, and having the president have immunity is part of it. So some of them are definitely going to vote for it. Alito, Thomas, Kavanaugh. That's how I feel. Whether it's going to prevail or not, I don't know. There are other people, we don't know what they will do. Roberts, it's less clear.
So this is all very depressing. Do you have what gives you hope about Americans? I mean, we have in the last few cycles, Americans rejected this pretty strongly, right? In all of the Senate races, Americans rejected this. Every single person who ran on a Stop the Steal platform, certainly on the Senate side, they all lost. I mean, I guess J.D. Vance is sort of in the middle there somewhere, but pretty much everyone else lost. Carrie Lake, all these people who were pushing election conspiracies, voters didn't go for it. They didn't go for it in 22 either, right? So in every election since Trump, every election since 2016, voters have basically said they want democracy, and they've told pollsters and told exit interviews that like democracy was an issue that they were voting on. Republicans think you hear a lot that nobody cares about that anymore. I think they do. Don't you think they do?
They do. I'm actually very optimistic because you've been asking me about bad actors.
Yeah, all right. I set you up for a very negative, negative tone.
But it's important because it's important to realize what we're up against. But I also, one of my mantras is never underestimate the American people. I mean, in the last years, we had two of the most giant nonviolent mass protest movements in history. The Women's March, which nobody talks about anymore, which led to, yeah, I know you do, and which led to an electoral outcome in the midterms of 2018. So many women got elected. And then we had Black Lives Matter, the largest, again, in U.S. history, with over 20 million people, multi-generational, multiracial. This was a giant phenomenon that in a pandemic that then flowed into the results, many firsts in 2022. So the American people have they're on the right path. They don't want to have their rights taken away. And the problem is MAGA is a very vocal minority, and now Trump has been able to get the GOP to do his bidding. He's imposed a kind of authoritarian cult dynamic. But the American people are a different story. So I always remain optimistic about the decency of the American people, and hope that the electoral environment in November will be such that enough people will come and vote.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think when you touch, I mean, we don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to talk about this intersection for women and liberty. And you talked about the Women's March. It's funny because this morning, as I was getting dressed, I was thinking about the Women's March, and I was thinking about if there is a Trump second term, what happens? Is there the same kind of backlash? Is it stronger? What do the women do? And some friends of mine have been saying recently their frustration that we're not demonstrating against the Dobbs decision and the Supreme Court debate about how many organs are allowed to fail before a doctor could intervene. And, the 14-year-old in Mississippi, who has been forced to carry and now raise her rapist child because she didn't know how to navigate the exceptions in the state of Mississippi for rape and incest. I mean, these stories are such fundamental questions of our human rights and of our freedoms and of democracy. And we've talked before, you and I, and there is like this sort of group of us, the like wonkies, the brainy wonks who talk all the time about these links between the rollback of women's rights and the rise of authoritarianism, or said a different way, right? That men cannot become authoritarians without rolling back women's rights, without diminishing the power and agency of women, right? So they go together. They invariably go together. So what happens? What happens now? Because I think we were there. The infrastructure of the Women's March doesn't really exist anymore. I don't know. I mean, Melinda Gates just gave $1 billion. It feels like a drop in the bucket to me. I don't know what happens. Where is it? What is it? The resistance again? I don't know. Did we become Iceland? Does every woman in America refuse to work and go into the streets? What difference does it make? How do you think about that? I was really thinking about it this morning. Like, what happens?
It's unpredictable, and there could be situations with the use of state force that would make it more difficult to have a mass protest. But I would be surprised if some kind of protest did not manifest if he comes to power, because people will realize very quickly that it's not just their rights; it's the rights of all it's going to be compromised. That's the thing we learned from authoritarianism. People think, oh, well, I'm not an immigrant, or I'm not a Jew, it's not going to affect me. And then later they see that's not the case. And I've been trying to put my expertise and the lessons learned from all my studies to talk about that with the American people on TV, et cetera, because it's really true. So we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see what happens, but it would be strange if it would be counter to the history, our recent history too, if we did not have some kind of mass protest.
Well, I'm going to predict, which I very wrongly did in 2016, I don't think he wins. I don't. And I have so many people who, it's not just the polls, which are, they're up, they're down. I don't think he has gained a share of, he has not gained in the electorate since 2016 or since 2020, right? There's not a whole new world of people that are like suddenly love him. I think there are problems that President Biden's going to have to deal with in a very serious way. He's an imperfect candidate, as are they all. I don't know. I think when faced with a choice, I think you're right. Like, I believe in the American people. And I think when they see what's at stake, I think even if it's in the 11th hour, they show up. But I just wanted to say thank you for your amazing work and encourage everyone to read Ruth's timeless book, Strongmen, because it really changed the way I think about the world. And I know everyone who's read it feels that way. And thank you for continuing to sometimes shout into the wind. That's a lot of what we do at Majority Rules. There's a lot of shouting into the wind. That's why we do this show, actually, because we can't always do it in other places. So we do it here and as people to think. So thank you so much, Ruth. My guest has been Ruth Ben-Ghiat, scholar, historian, author of Strongmen and many other amazing books and articles. And we will be back next week with another episode of Majority Rules. Next week with my also friend, I keep asking my friends to come on the show. It's just how this goes. With my friend Jessica Yellen, who is taking on a whole other challenge, which is how to have unbiased and easy to digest news in ways that Americans can actually absorb, that is well-researched and that is grounded in fact. It's called News Not Noise. She's done amazing work with it, and I'm excited to talk to her next week. So come back and join us next week. I'm Lauren Leader. This is Majority Rules. Thanks for being with us.